All right, welcome back to another beautiful day on the back deck. Um, it's been a minute since I've given you any lecture-based input, so let's get back down to it, to the bare bones, if you will. Hope you're all doing well. I have assigned you that yesterday the anthropology third set of slide downloads, and there's, gosh, I don't know, like 15 of them this time, maybe. This will have a lot of information wrapping up most of the anatomical aspects of the skeleton in accordance with the skeleton scheme graphic that you have allegedly already turned in. See, I'm making this before. Anyway, it's a different day and time. Anywho, so if you would refer to your anthropology third set, the black background, I think is what it looks like, at least outside. And we'll finish up the specifics of the bones, bone markings, and get into fractures, cracks, breaks, and how that plays a role in determining causes of death or identification of the body thereafter from the anthropologic standpoint. All right, so after your title slide, right, we move on to bone markings, depressions, and openings. The last lecture, I think, ended on the bulges, the tuberosities, the tubercles, the head, those bone markings that are outward for muscle and ligament attachment. And now we're looking at the opposite, the holes, the opening, the depressions. So, depressions and openings. We're looking at a couple of different funny, strange words that you may not have used before in regular life unless you're in the medical track. So, a meatus. Some people say meatus, but more medical professionals do pronounce that word as meatus. Bones have to interact with the rest of the soft tissue of the body and have openings, holes through which veins and arteries and nerves can travel. So, it's all a system within a system, and you need passageways for these very important soft tissue elements through which they'll travel. So they're basically conduits. So a meatus is an opening. We have small openings throughout all of our irregular bones of our vertebrae, and meatus in in all of our long bones that contain a good amount of marrow for the blood production that occurs within the marrow to be able to be distributed from inside the skeleton throughout the rest of the body through the meatus. And then our second term is sinus, and many of you are totally familiar with, like sinus pressure. You get a sinus headache this time of year with all of the pollen around. You can have some histematic response where fluid builds up in these cavities and causes pressure on the soft tissue, and pressure will oftentimes translate into discomfort or pain. So sinuses are are basically cavities, and in most cases fluid-filled cavities in the body. Neat side note, I'm full of them. At least side notes, maybe not so neat to some of you, but whales. The blue whale, the largest living animal on the planet, larger than even the largest of the dinosaurs. The blue whale and many of its relatives, all of the baleen whales, they can dive down so deep, thousands of meters below the sea, and withstand pressures that would crush any man-made device, minus super high-tech deep diving submarines. Um, these are, air-breathing mammals, so they have to come to the surface and take a lung full of air, 2 lungs full of air, I should say, um, and having any compressible space within their body would be terminal at the pressures found at the depths at which they dive. So a whale's skull, its sinuses are full of oil, and this oil, as a liquid, cannot be compressed. And these huge skulls have a very large capacity for that oil, and unfortunately, it's what makes the whale such a good survivor in its lifestyle that it carries out. But conversely, on the bad side of it, is that it's what makes the whale the valuable victim of the whaling industry from, the dawn of civilization. Whale oil was a very valuable product before the discovery of fossil fuels. Oils that we can dig out of the ground instead of have to dig out of a whale. So people were slaughtering these whales to get the whale oil. And if any of you of the Jewish faith out there, any of my fellow Jews or half-Jews, or anyone that's familiar with the story of Hanukkah about the lamp that had only enough oil to stay lit for one night, lasted for 7 beautiful nights. Eight beautiful nights, the 8 days of Hanukkah. My bad. So that was whale oil that did that miraculous Jewish tradition. Anyway, super side note there. But these sinus cavities are full of fluid, and we have them here in our skull. They're below our orbits and behind our frontal bone. And they can, fill up with fluid and cause all sorts of issues that require pressure release. So a sinus is a vessel that will hold a fluid. All right, third term down is a fissure. And a fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. And we see these in some of the bones of the orbits. We're looking at the ethmoid bones on either side of your nose that are behind your eyeballs and underneath them, and the sphenoid bones, those that make up the outside lateral aspect of your orbits. They have fissures through which the optic nerve and other motor nerves travel to move your eyes around and allow you to see. And blood vessels and the like that need to keep your eyes good and healthy. So a fissure is a slit-like opening. And then the big one, the famous one, the favorite one, is the foramen. And the biggest foramen is a round or oval opening in a bone. Now, the orbits are not foramens. The orbits are a collection of 7 bones in each that make up a structure. A foramen is, like a giant gaping hole. And a foramen, the foramen magnum, is that big opening at the base of your skull through which your brainstem extends into your spinal cord and connects the top end, to where all the thought and control comes from, to the bottom end where all of the action happens. So the foramen is a large opening. And we also have smaller foramen through which our peripheral nerves branch off of our spinal cord going down the dorsal side. Somebody's always shooting. Going down the dorsal side, your back, you have that spinal cord, your main central nervous system control unit, highway, and off of each vertebral union shoot out very thick and long peripheral nerves, and they travel through the foramens, little ones. So, I'm actually having some. That's one of the nerves that I had significant damage done to in the car accident I was in 20 years ago. Peripheral nerve. I didn't actually sever my spinal cord at the neck. I did some damage to the spinal cord, but I did do some severance of the peripheral nerves that innervate, my axial, or excuse me, my appendicular skeletal muscles. So that's why I can't walk. Anyway, so foramen, we got big ones and we got little ones. Holes that are round or oval. Okay, so then we can move on to out of the anatomy of the little specifics of the parts to fractures, and there's a bunch of different fractures, and some of them are gross. I have given this lecture, 100 times plus, and I've actually been a guest speaker at different high schools talking about fractures and things to nursing classes and other forensics courses. And sometimes the subject matter, just thinking of the breaks or looking at some of the X-ray images, freak people out, get you lightheaded or whatnot. So, if this is like, oof, ugh, turn this stuff off and, leave it alone, don't worry about it. But most people, can handle this, and I do keep it very scientific, PG, and it's not terribly graphic. All right, but it is. I'd like to throw that out there as a warning. Some of the stuff freaks me out. So anyway, couple of different major types of fractures, and some can lead to death. Some are lethal fractures, especially if you're talking about a depression fracture of the flat bones of the skull, or a major compound fracture at which the bones actually protrude through the skin to the outward environment. If that's untreated, you're gonna die, given a compound fracture. More likely than not, you're gonna die. So compound is the big one. The first term is the compound fracture, and these take a whole lot of force. These are found most often in motor vehicle accidents, by the motorcycle accidents, car accidents, car hitting a pedestrian accident, really bad bike accidents, falls from quite a height, people that are pushed off of buildings or cliffs, or people that jump off of buildings or cliffs, either for base jumping purposes or for other terminal motivations. So when a bone is subjected to enough force, and it takes an incredible amount of force to break a bone, if it's subjected to enough force where it's going to go past a bend, past a small crack, and completely separate itself at the ramus, and have enough force thereafter absorbing all of that energy to tear through the flesh and muscle and skin, that is a compound fracture, and it is devastating. Even just to look at them, it's devastating. So these are not incredibly common, and when you're talking about broken bones seen at the ED, the emergency department, these are major accident or major violent event caused fractures. A compound is the worst. Most of your fractures are what the medical community would refer to as simple fractures. Simple, meh, and that's your common ones. The ones where you break, you fell off your bike and you put your arms out, and you had a simple fracture of your radius and or ulna. You kicked the side of the worst, the bed frame. You accidentally caught your pinky toe on it and cranked your toe out. And, there's now a simple fracture in one of your metatarsals of your foot, or your actual phalanges of your foot. Break a finger, do something silly, accidental, jam it, you can have a simple fracture. A lot of your low impact, low intensity sport accidents skateboarding, basketball, football. You get a simple fracture, um, and it's a closed fracture. Closed fractures are not very traumatic in the long run. They do heal quite well. Typically, don't require a whole lot of doctoring to fix them up. But they will leave a scar in the bone that can help identify who that person is if there's medical records and a suspicion of who that skeleton may have belonged to, and they have a history of a broken bone in the past. X-rays of the actual break can line up to X-rays of the healed post-mortem body and be a very conclusive match to this bone was definitely inside that person when they were alive. Neat. All right, a third one is a pretty devastating one called the spiral fracture. And this typically happens down in your lower leg, the tibia or the fibula. The spiral fracture is just as stated, twisting. Not necessarily so much a twisted ankle where you actually typically don't break anything, you're just separating some tendons or ligaments. Still painful. But a twisted bone. We see this in soccer, lacrosse, football, in the lower leg. Somebody pivots wrong, you get just the right amount of force downward and torsion, and you get a spiral fracture. And these are significant. Spiral fractures typically require a, at the very least, external fixation, if not a cast, certainly, definitely a cast, or internal fixation where there's going to have to be a pin, plates, and screws to put all of this junk back together and make it somewhat straight again. So spirals are rough, and I've got X-ray shots in the following slides that you may have previewed or have access to. All right, the next one is, as previously mentioned, the depression fracture. And depression fractures are oftentimes blunt force trauma to the skull. And these are very dangerous. Obviously, the skull, one of its primary objectives, primary function of the skull is to protect the brain. And these flat bones, the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, these guys make a nice helmet for your basically scrambled egg-like brain organ. And if something hits this, a bat, a golf club, a pipe, a hammer, all the awful things that people use to do terrible damage, you get a depression fracture, an actual, the flat part of the bone crunches inward, and it's depressed. This causes massive brain swelling, oftentimes hemorrhaging, many times sudden death or death shortly thereafter incurring the injury. And these can hold very good clues as to cause of death and in some cases manner of death as a result. Anthropologists and pathologists can match up what specific tool may or may not have been used to cause this depression fracture. The somewhat elastic property of living bone will allow for impressions to be made prior to fracture. And so a depressed fracture is a flat bone injury, typically, as stated, blunt force trauma to the flat bones of the skull. Not to be confused with the next term of compression fracture. And a compression fracture, not where a flat bone dents in, causes brain damage or death. Compression happens typically to the irregular bones of your spinal column. Compression fracture, jumpers, people that do, attempt or succeed in committing suicide, that jump up a lot of times do land on their feet, because there's that no matter what your, despair is that led, that poor soul to wanting to end their life, there is that life-saving mechanism where you automatically want to put your hands out or land on your feet, even if you jumped from 80 stories high. But when you land on your feet, your whole spinal column compresses, and the bones are actually crushed. And my neck injury, I broke several of my cervical vertebrae, the vertebrae in my neck from C1 down to C7. I broke C7, C6, C5, and C4. Compression fracture. The car that I was in rolled several times and the roof collapsed down. It turned my head around over the other side of my shoulder. My chin was back here. So I had a spiral fracture of the C7 vertebrae. And then on the second roll, the roof crushed in more and squished my head down and compressed my cervical vertebrae. So when the car was done doing its rolls, we ended up upside down. I was fully conscious. I sustained no head injury, because my neck took all the shock. Great. And, upside down with my head about 2 inches shorter, lower than it's supposed to be, and facing that way instead of this way. So it's kind of super duper freaky in that, I was looking at my back and upside down and somewhat uncomfortable. Compression fractures. So, it's not all just jumpers. You can be a passenger in a car and, in a matter of 2 seconds go from a regular day on the way to the beach to, a major change in plans. So compression fractures is a crushing fracture. So the poorest bones mentioned in this definition are that of the vertebrae most typically. Compression fracture. And you can imagine there's all sorts of nerve damage that can occur from the nerves that travel through those, in between those discs when they're crushed. So if we advance to the next slide, we can see the two common types, the is that a spiral or comminuted and a compression. The comminuted fracture is similar to the spiral. It deals with a compressive activity, and a long bone is broken up into a bunch of pieces that were at least the weakest point in that full compression. So you can get a compression fracture in a long bone, like your tibia, especially if you jump, or if if you're messing around and jump off a roof, people do it. I used to jump off our garage roof all the time, when I was a kid. People jump from heights that are just a little too high for their bones to handle. Happens all the time. Kids' accidents, fall off a swing set, land the wrong way. There's so many different ways to go about a compression fracture. It doesn't have to be, mortal. It doesn't have to be jumping from a tall building. You can jump off fall out of a tree, land on your feet, bam, comminuted fracture in your tibia. Escape a house fire from the second story. You're going to die if you stay in. Jump. Hope for the best. That's a comminuted fracture. Bam, hit the ground. And then your compression fracture is showed on the right-hand side of the picture. And the fractures are indicated in the diagrams as the red lines. And if you can see well enough on your screen, the X-ray views of those exact fractures appear as they are. So downward pressure, lots of force cause a comminuted or a compression fracture. Okay? And do I have time for who's next? I don't have time. I'm going to leave it at that because we're at a 24-minute spot. Supposed to limit to 25. So bam. We'll get back into more fracture talk and some of my super injuries for the next time we meet. Hope you're well, and we'll get back to it. Have a good day.